Well, all right. Hey, my name is Pastor Corey, and I get to be the lead pastor here at Westwinds. Can I just brag about our church for a minute? Can you just grant me a little bit of space to do that? Some of you know I get to be the head coach of a local hockey team here, high school hockey team, Jackson United. And that's fine. You can cheer for them. That's great. And last night we played our last home game, so playoffs start next week. We played our last home game, and it was like senior night, and there was all these escapades and extra stuff. And my favorite moment was I got to look across the ice, and sitting in the stands was a bunch of people from Westwinds. And and this has been all season long. We've had like 13 home games this year, and I think there's been folks from Westwinds there at each of those home games. And what's been really cool for me is watching my players come here on Sundays and seeing people from our church who were at their games. And I just love that, man, we are the kind of church that shows up to youth hockey games and the little things and spreading the love of God that way and making sure that the students of our community know they're loved and cared for. So I just wanted to thank you all and brag on you a little bit. I think that is absolutely incredible. Do I have a purpose? Do I have a purpose? I've actually been talking about this question for a long, long time. Actually, the first sermon I ever preached, like outside of a preaching class, right? I went to school and I had these preaching classes, and then eventually you guys stand up in front of real people and give it a try. And the first opportunity I had to preach outside of class was to a group of middle school students. And I was like, what do I want to say to this group of middle school students? And what I wanted to talk with them about is that they have this incredible future, right? That like God has a purpose for them, a call on their life, that there's so much life ahead of them. And so I wrote this 3-part sermon, right? It was this. It was like, God has a plan for you. He wants all of you, and his plan is good. That was the sermon, right? Except I would make them like scream it back at me, right? So, hey, can we actually try this? Can we pretend we're in middle school for a minute? Okay. So this is how the sermon would start. I'd say, repeat after me. God has a plan for me. He wants all of me. But, and the kids would like giggle a little bit because we're saying but, But the plan is good. It's good. It's real good. Yeah, so that was the message, right? And what I love kind of talking about in that was it was all built around the origin story of people in the book of Genesis. That this story that starts in a garden, and God creates these two people called Adam and Eve in the story. And the Bible says that they were completely naked, right? Which middle school kids also find a little comical, right? And that they were completely naked, and that they used to just walk with God in the garden, right? It was symbolism. It was symbolizing that there was nothing separating people from each other and nothing separating people from God. This was God's perfect creation. And I said, God gave them one rule to follow. And I said, how many of you would like to have just one rule to follow, right? They're all like, yeah, right here, right? And they had one rule to follow. They couldn't eat from this one tree. That sounds pretty easy, right? Yeah. Well, you wouldn't believe what they did. They ate from the tree. And they realized they were naked. Now there's problems between people. And they hid from God. And what I love telling them about is actually one of my favorite parts of the entire scriptures. It might actually be my favorite part of the whole Bible. Adam and Eve are hiding from God, and they know they've like messed up God's perfect plan for the world. And the first words out of God's mouth are, Adam, where are you? Where are you? And to be able to tell a group of middle school students, it doesn't matter how far you feel from God, or if you're resisting God or hiding from God, or you don't know where God is in your life. What we know about this God is in pursuit of you. He has a plan for you. He wants all of you. He wants this relationship with you, and his plan is good. I'd often tell these middle school kids about my dreams when I was little. When I was little, all I ever wanted to do was play in the National Hockey League, right? I was gonna be a professional hockey player. And all of that changed when I was like 15, 16 years old. I was in the middle of a field at a summer camp. And God had a conversation with me about going into ministry, about becoming a pastor, about giving my life to the church instead of to professional hockey. And after a long debated conversation with God, I said, okay. I said, all right. And a part of the message was being able to proclaim all the good things that I've been able to be a part of up to that point in my life in following the will of God, that he wanted all of me, but that his plan was good. The sermon ends with asking students to think about their life like a timeline. Like back here, you're like a baby and you're born and you kind of move through life. And for them, like they're not very far in the timeline, right? Right? You kind of, you go through your childhood, you go to elementary school, and you get to middle school, right? And you're just kind of where you're at. I wanted to make sure that students understood that it's not that there aren't hard things in the timeline. That God's plan being good doesn't mean things won't ever get difficult. That actually what that means is that when you get to the other end of your timeline, some of you are getting closer to this side, right? And you look back on your life, and you see all those difficult things that you've been through, that in hindsight, you'll look back and you'll never regret following the will of God. You look back on those difficult moments and you'll actually be able to testify to God's goodness, like the way God showed up in the midst of those. And when you're in them, you might not see it, right? When you're in the midst of them, they don't feel like God's good. But when you get to the end, and you're looking back on your life, you realize that God's plan for your life was good. Now, this is, again, just a message for middle school kids, I know, right? And when you're talking to a group of middle school students, like, there's so much optimism. There's like all their life is in front of them. But having this conversation, like, do I have a purpose, with a mature audience like yourself, is a little bit more complicated, isn't it? Because you've been through some stuff. And sometimes like the dreams that even you had as a middle school student, they didn't happen in real life, did they? Some of the optimism you might have had as a young person, some of the dreams about where your life would go and how things would work out and all these, these pathways that you felt like God had for you. You get to this age and life is a little bit more real. Maybe there's some grief or some disappointment. There's some maybe more pessimism, less optimism. Do you know that in the Genesis story, there's more to the story, actually. There's a whole part of the story that I never read to middle school students because they're in middle school. I want to look at what happens here after God finds Adam and Eve, There's this long conversation about the consequences of the world now, of what the world is going to be like because of what happened in the garden. In Genesis chapter 3, starting in verse 16, this is what God says to the woman. To the woman, he said, I will make your pregnancy very painful. In pain, you will bear children. You will desire your husband, but he will rule over you. Thus saith the Lord. Thanks for coming. I'm just joking. I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. All right. And I think sometimes like we look at this text and this is the curse on women, right? In this moment. And I think we try, you can try to read this text thousands of years later and it's got like curse language is kind of old and it feels kind of awkward, but you got to remember like this was a story that stood as an oral tradition long before it was written down. I want you to imagine for me God's people when they would have been telling this story to each other as they're, wandering the wilderness, living in desert places. And women are bearing children in tents in the midst of extreme poverty. And the men are off trying to figure out, like, how are we going to get food to eat? How are we going to keep our family alive in the wilderness? I imagine it would have felt a bit like a curse, would it not? I want you to imagine for me a season of life when God's people were in slavery in Egypt. And they were forced to build bricks and bricks and bricks and bricks under the strong hand of the Egyptians. And women were bearing children in the midst of this extreme slavery, while their husbands were off trying to continue to produce enough bricks to keep their family alive. I don't know. Might have felt a bit like a curse. Might have felt a bit like, man, this world we live in ain't right. Where is God in the midst of this? I don't know. Maybe even still today. I'm not a woman. I can't speak to your situation. But maybe there are times when the hierarchy of men and women begins to wear on you. Maybe there were times when dreams were taken away because you had to bear the children. Maybe there are times when it felt like maybe it kept you from your purpose, your calling, what you dreamed and thought life would be. Or maybe difficulty having children felt like a curse, where you couldn't be who you thought you were supposed to be. Verse 17, he then addresses the man. To the man, he said, because you listened to your wife's voice and you ate from that tree I commanded, don't eat from it. Cursed is the fertile land because of you. In pain, you will eat from it every day. In pain, you will eat from it every day of your life. Weeds and thistles will grow for you, even as you eat the field's plants. By the sweat of your face, you will eat bread until you return to the fertile land, since from it you were taken. You are soil, and to soil you will return. Again, I want you to imagine for me a little bit, maybe being a man back when God's people were wandering the wilderness and this origin story was being shared. These stories were being told verbally to one another. And you're in the wilderness and you're worried about your family. Will they survive? Can I provide enough food for my kids to eat? Will my wife make it? Will we live to see another day? I'm working, but I'm out here in the wilderness and this ground is just not producing enough. Or perhaps you imagine being a slave in Egypt, building brick after brick after brick. And the money that is coming, the resources that are there just aren't enough to make ends meet. I wonder if this life would feel a bit like a curse. A curse. Do you, I don't know, maybe some of us feel that even today. That our lives where we just work and work and work. And it doesn't really matter how much we work, we just can't ever get ahead. At times we hate our jobs but love our families. Feel like we're maybe trapped in the systems of this world. I don't know. Maybe at times it feels like a curse. As the story goes on, it doesn't end in Genesis chapter 3. It continues into Genesis chapter 4. And Adam and Eve, they have these two sons named Cain and Abel. And the curse of the garden continues to spiral to a terrible place where we have our first murder in Scripture. Cain, out of jealousy, actually murders his brother Abel. And then there's a conversation with the Lord, with God and Cain. The Lord comes to Cain and says, Cain, where is your brother Abel? Where is your brother Abel? Cain said, I don't know. Am I my brother's guardian? Or perhaps you've heard it said more famously, am I my brother's keeper? And you've been reading the story since the garden. You know, as a reader, you're like, yeah, you are. The plan was for us to take care of each other. The plan was for us to be vulnerable with each other, to not need to protect ourselves from each other. That was the plan in the garden. Sometimes I think these stories would have been told in seasons in the wilderness when people were starting to think, man, I just need to take care of myself. I just need to take care of my family. I know we're all out here, right? But there's not enough to go around, so I need to make sure I take care of myself. Am I really my brother's keeper? Is it really my job to take care of this tent over here? I just need to take care of my tent. Imagine in times in Egypt, the temptation to kind of try to make a little more of yourself so you and your family could have more while your brothers and sisters are suffering. Maybe today, some of us feel that same tension in life. One of the things that I think is incredibly profound in this story is there's this language of this curse on people. But God doesn't disappear from the story in the midst of the tension. I actually think this is probably what is good news to the people as this story is being shared about their origins. That there's this moment in Genesis chapter 3, like after all of this conversation with God and Adam and God and Eve, there's this whole thing. And then it says, then God knit together clothes for Adam and Eve. Then God knit together clothes for them. Why did they need clothes? Because they were naked. Well, why did they know they were naked? Well, because they had sinned. Because they sinned against who? God. And who is there in the midst of that moment, knitting together clothes for them, showing them mercy and grace, not removing his presence from this difficult situation, but leaning in and clothing Adam and Eve? See, I think this is the beginning of God's people beginning to wrestle with this idea of purpose. I mean, these were God's people. Why are we in the wilderness? These are God's people. Why are we in slavery? This can't be our purpose. God, you created me. You created us for a purpose. How could this be it? But God's presence in the midst of the wilderness, God's presence in Egypt, God's presence in the garden in the midst of this curse begins these redemptive questions for God's people to ask. I think these are some of them. What if work is not a curse? What if family and the systems of family, what if family is not a burden? What if your neighbors are not your enemies? But what if your neighbors are your brothers and sisters? See, the question is not if God has abandoned us in our work, or God has abandoned us in our family, or God has abandoned us in our relationships with our neighbors and our neighbors' neighbors. The question is whether or not we can find him there. It's learning to see God in our work and in our family and in our neighborhoods. This God who is seeking and clothing and keeping us. I think this is challenging when we talk about purpose, because so often in the world that we grew up in, purpose, this conversation about purpose is tied intimately with activity. That I have a purpose because of what I'm gonna do. Or I have purpose because of what I'm doing. See, but with God, purpose is not tied to activity. Purpose is tied to identity. You have a purpose because you are a child of God. You have a purpose because God has given you a purpose in the midst of your actual life. That God's people still had a purpose after they messed up in the garden, and God's people still had purpose when they're wandering the wilderness, and God's people still had purpose under the strong hand of Pharaoh in the lands of Egypt. God's people have never lost God's purpose based on their situations. See, we are called to purpose in our work. I mean, like, what if your job is not meaningless? Now, I know that like every job is not glamorous. And probably a lot of us in the room ended up doing jobs we never thought we'd have. Probably a lot of us have even settled for jobs to make our lives work. And that's difficult, and that takes some grieving at times. But what if even then your job is not meaningless? Because every job touches image bearers of God. That you bear the image of God, and the person working next to you bears the image of God. What if in the midst of your work, God longs for you to identify with purpose in his kingdom? What about family? I mean, like, what if home, whatever home is for you, is not an obstacle to calling, right? It's not an obstacle to the purpose that you have on your life. Now, I get this. Family is hard. Family is hard, and it's wildly complicated. I think it's significant that Jesus' first miracle was at a family gathering, right? It was a wedding. And that with Jesus' final breath and resurrection, what were they proclaiming that Jesus was doing with his resurrection but starting a new family? What if family or home or whatever that system is not an obstacle to your purpose, but a place where God might show up and meet you in the midst of it? What about our neighbors, right? Like what if the person across the street or on the other cubicle or across the classroom is not a competition or inconvenience in your life? What if that neighbor on the other side of the world is not in competition with you, is not dangerous to you, but an image bearer? What if our purpose to love our neighbors and our enemies is real? Like what if when Jesus talks about that, like he meant it? That we're called to this purpose of loving our neighbors and our enemies. I think this is so confusing in our world today because everything, all the messaging is built around fearing your neighbors and quickly identifying your enemies so you might protect yourself from them. But what if the message of Jesus is rooted in the love of your neighbor and the love of your enemies? See, I think sometimes we need to learn and recognize that purpose is not just like a special assignment. Our purpose is not in just like some dramatic calling on our life. That purpose, in my world is not like a ministry title, That purpose is our identity and our calling to live in the kingdom of God in very ordinary places of our life. Maybe we struggle with purpose not because we lack direction, but because we're missing out on God's presence. Friends, can I just say, you don't need to escape your life to find purpose. Can I say that one more time? You don't need to escape your life to find purpose. Actually, I'll say this another way. You don't need to do great things to find purpose. You don't need to fulfill all the dreams of middle school you to find purpose. That God meets us in the ordinary places of our lives. This is why, I think this is actually a big part of why Lent comes before Easter Sunday. And why the church for thousands of years around the entire globe moves through Lent before we get to Easter Sunday. This season starts this Wednesday with Ash Wednesday. And I hope you'll join us. But do you know the phrase of Ash Wednesday is? From soil we have come, and to the soil we will return. Where's that from? The Genesis story. From the dust we have come, and to the dust we will return. The story begins. Lent begins with recognizing our humanity inside of our actual lives, like the ground we stand on, the ground we toil in. That's where the Lent story begins. And then we'll have a bunch of conversations for a few weeks about who we are as a people. And then the next turn in the story are the last 2 weeks. And it begins with 2 Sundays before Easter. It's called Palm Sunday. Which Palm Sunday, it's like we got these pictures of the palm branches and Hosanna, and it's like really nice, right? But if you read the whole story, Palm Sunday is a disruption. It's a disruption of the status quo. That if we want to get to resurrection, we might need to disrupt some of the status quo of our life. And then we get to Good Friday, where we seek out what might need to die in our lives so we might experience resurrection. And then we gather together on Easter Sunday and celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And it's this resurrection that gives us all purpose in the story. That the resurrection of Jesus started a movement of God among ordinary people in the midst of their ordinary lives to proclaim good news. See, the Genesis curse names the fracture that we have in our work, in our families, in our relationships. But Jesus restores those fractures not by erasing the world. I mean, he carries out, like God doesn't show up in the Genesis scene and go, you know what, guys? I'm just gonna start over. I read the story, I'm like, he shoulda. Why not? First time didn't work. There's just 2 people to eliminate. We can get rid of this garden. We'll create a new one, 2 new people. Maybe these 2 won't mess it up, right? God doesn't do that. And the good news of Jesus is the same thing. It's not that Jesus comes to the scene and erases everything and starts things over, but meets us in the fracture of our world, in the fracture of our relationship with the work, in the fracture of our relationship with our families and our neighbors. He meets us in that fracture and reminds us of this renewal work he's doing in the midst of our actual world. I wonder today if what we might need is that kind of renewal, a baptism of sorts, a change of perspective, an opening of our eyes, maybe mercy or some grace in the midst of the struggle. And so today, we're going to demonstrate just some of that work. We're going to baptize 3 people today. These 3 people. 1 is going to be at this service, and 2 is going to be at the next. And if you're wondering, yes, you can stay for a second round, okay? Just take a minute. Read these statements of renewal, of hope, in the midst of people's actual lives. Baptism is a mark, it's a mark in these folks' lives of something that God is doing in their lives. But we practice baptism as an entire community. It's a means of grace. Actually, the way we talk about here at Westwinds is it's baptism and remembering our baptism. Because we need to remember our baptism, don't we? That in the midst of our lives, God is doing this renewing work that he invites us into every single day. As our candidate gets ready, I want to close with this passage of scripture. In Matthew chapter 22, starting in verse 34, these Pharisees, these religious people, they came to Jesus. They had heard that Jesus had left the Sadducees, this other group of religious people. He left them speechless. And they met together. One of them, a legal expert, tested him. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, these religious experts, it's their job to know the answer to this question. It is their purpose to tell everybody else what is the greatest commandment of the law. Part of their purpose in life was actually to figure out who was in and who was out based on how we define these laws. You understand how important this question might have been for them. What is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus says to them, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You must love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. Your entire purpose bends on these two commandments. Do I have a purpose? I do have a purpose. God has a plan for me, for you, for us. He wants all of me. He wants all of you. He wants all of us. And his plan, it's good. It's so good.